development I would want to mention here is the rise of and the increasing assertiveness of China. China certainly has reshaped and is reshaping its view and its neighborhood for sure, but the neighborhood is becoming actually very large. If you look at the One Belt, One Road initiative, it will one way or another include 50–60% or so of world population and world GDP. So we are talking here of quite a reorientation of global power play, and I think it's fair to say that already now, in many respects, we are in a Eurasian century in the sense that trade relations between Asia and Europe have become more important than trade relations between Europe and the United States. So this is a clear reorientation on the global scene. And I think the third element that I want to mention is certainly that the European Union has regained, if I may, some confidence in itself. Now we shall see how strong and how long-lasting that is, but certainly there is a renewed acceptance into the wish of Europe to become also a global power that sets global trade rules and global trade standards and cooperates with partners around the world to establish high standards in trade and investment. And so you may have noted that very soon after Mr. Trump had arrived in office, the Japanese came with a high-level delegation to Brussels and was saying, well, let's close a trade deal and let's finish our negotiations. And it was actually finished very quickly. And so, and the Europeans were actually ready to do it. And I think there is more willingness on the European side to move forward. Now, I think it would be, to conclude my introduction, I think it would be wrong to reduce our relation just to trade and investment. And that's why in today's program we have one panel, the first panel, which really looks at what I just described, this geopolitical discussion, but zooming in specifically on the trade and investment relations. But then we have a second and a third panel, and the second panel looks at what we call the people channel, which is about diaspora and migration as a path for knowledge transfer. And we look at the technology channel, which is about the digital world, security, privacy, and public finance. So I think both very important aspects of this very multifaceted relation. Now, I'm sure that we could have many more channels here, but we cannot do everything in one day. So we focused on these three, and I very much think that we will have a very enjoyable discussion today, where we all want to learn from each other. And let me wish all of us and a very welcome again and a very successful conference and a very good discussion today. So thank you again, and without much further ado, let me pass the floor to Emilio Lamo de Espinosa from Elcano Institute.
Thank you very much, Guntram. Very good morning to all of you. It's a real pleasure to be here today, joining forces with Bruegel and Giga to celebrate the first European Union CELAC Economic Forum. I hope this forum will be followed by others and kickstart a lasting partnership between our institutions. My own institute, the Elcano Royal Institute, a rather young think tank created in 2002, is a private foundation financed mainly by Spanish big and not so big companies. And we are and have always been focusing strongly on Latin America for obvious historical and cultural reasons, reinforced later, as is known, by a huge Spanish economic investment in the region, in Latin America, that now is moving in the other direction towards the European Union. I invite all of you to visit our webpage, where you will find a lot of information of the region. We are just about to publish a study on why Latin America matters to the European Union, because at least we think it should matter, and it should matter much more than it matters today. No? We are thus strongly committed to building bridges between the European Union and Latin America. Indeed, that's one of the main missions of the Elcano's office here in Brussels now. So let me begin by congratulating and thanking our partners for this wonderful initiative. Let me then advance a few reflections beyond trade and investment, as Guntram said before, with the hope that they might somehow contribute to generate the frame of this discussion. The first one is to emphasize the deep organic and organic bonds that tie our two regions together, Europe and Latin America, bonds grounded in common history and substantiated in common languages, legal traditions, value systems, and institutional structures. They provide, I think, a very, very solid foundation to engage in sustained political dialogue. Let me say it clearly, Latin America, I think, is an indispensable part of the European and of Western civilization. A statement that does not need, I guess, further justification, but that is frequently forgotten, not only Europe, also in Latin America. You mentioned President Trump, for example, and even sometimes in Latin America itself. So when we talk and think of Atlantic bonds and of Atlantic alliances, we almost always refer to North Atlantic bonds and forget the deep, deep connection between the Iberian Peninsula, between Portugal and Spain with Latin America, a deep and vibrant South Atlantic link. Let's not forget that the Spanish language has more native speakers than English, only second to Chinese, about 500 million speakers of Spanish as native tongue, 200 million native speakers of Portuguese. Latin America doubles the size of Europe or China, has only one failed state, only one decrepit dictatorship, one and a half emerging now, and is today about 7% of world GDP, more than Japan. All of these things deserve more prominence in European and Western political discourse. As we all know, the European Global Strategy refers to the existence of an enlarged Atlantic space. I think that's very true. Latin America is no longer the far west, as Alain Ruquier labeled it years ago. A region that becomes ever more relevant in a world characterized by what some have called the rise of the rest, a world that is supposedly moving away from a Western-centric order. And in this context, I think Europe needs to see its organic bonds with Latin America indeed as an strategic asset. An asset to promote common universal values such as democracy, human rights, and a rules-based international system. An asset to fight so-called transnational threats or challenges, strengthen the security of cyberspace and protect our environment, but also, finally, an asset in the strictly geopolitical sense of the word. Think, for instance, of how we should work together to create a more integrated Atlantic space and tap onto the great economic and demographic potential of the Atlantic Basin, including Europe, Africa's eastern seaboard, and the Western Hemisphere. We constantly hear that the future is in the Pacific and often ignore the potential of this Atlantic neighborhood. The future has not been written yet, and together we can build a future in which the Atlantic world continues to play a central role in global politics. Moreover, the growing geopolitical, economic, and strategic importance of the Asia-Pacific region actually underscores also the importance of Latin America, because Latin America is also a Pacific reality, availed by a history full of fruitful economic, cultural, and diplomatic exchanges between that region and the Asia-Pacific world. I know this too well, and let me allow just a minute of publicity. Frequently, I am asked what Elcano, the name of my institute, stands for. Well, my institute bears the name of Juan Sebastián Elcano, the first European to circumnavigate the world, connecting America and Europe through the Pacific. Almost 500 years ago, 1519, an expedition initially commanded by the Portuguese sailor Magellan and completed precisely by Elcano, succeeded in the first round-the-world trip and set the foundations for the Manila Galleon, a system of convoys between Acapulco and Mexico and Manila that for more than 250 years brought Europe, America, and Asia together, probably the first maritime Silk Road. Some historians, such as the British Arnold Toynbee, refer to that period as the first expansion of the West, and we can say today that it was the first wave of globalization. Today, Latin America still constitutes another entry door for Europe into the Pacific, and this is availed by the European Union growing interest in the Pacific Alliance, in which 20 member states participate as observers. Well, I'll leave it at that. I thought it could be useful to keep in mind the broader historical and geopolitical foundations of our relationship before getting into the nitty-gritty of European Union CELAC Economic Cooperation. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all a very productive forum. Thank you.
Okay, also from me, a big welcome to everybody here, and a great thank you to the organizer from the Bruegel Institute, the Elcano, and also the support from the EU CELAC Foundation. I'm Bert Hoffmann from the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, which has got 4 institutes on the different world regions: Africa, Asia, Middle East, and Latin America. That is where I work. And I'm also very much in line with what you have said. I think we all share the interest of bringing Latin America and the Caribbean stronger onto the European agenda in all type of relations. We have 3 panels on trade and investment, on people and diaspora contacts, and on technology. In these welcome remarks, I just would briefly want to point out a specific item which I think we should not forget. It has been said, we all know it, but we have to reflect on it strongly. There are no 2 other world regions today who are as strongly committed to democracy and republican traditions and to a multilateral world order than Europe and Latin America. We cannot find other regions where this is as deeply rooted in present politics. And I think that is a very profound incentive to work more closely together, also on strategic issues, of course for people-to-people contact, for many things, but also as partners in a multilateral world order on very broad area of issues. And just to complement perhaps the links, you sketch a very broad picture, just to say that it's, of course, Spain and Portugal very much at the forefront of European relations to Latin America, but by far not the only ones. We've got all the Italian immigration to the southern cone. We've got the German migration to southern Brazil very strongly, but we also have got Britain, France, and the Netherlands with very strong ties to the Caribbean. We should not forget that this really is a very European issue and not just one of a few member states, but it's quite transversal, and I think we should always keep in mind that this really is a broad issue for us, especially in moments where certainties we took for granted for a long time, be it the US, the role of the US in world politics, be it the Brexit, be it what we are facing in Spain, Catalonia today. Things have been changing or are in change, and we have more uncertainties probably than before. We should certainly make sure that the ties we have and the good working relations we have, by and large, between those 2 areas really are a solid foundation to work on for the future. These are welcome remarks. We all come here for the discussions and the debates and the input from the speakers. The shorter we are, the more time we have for the purpose of the conference. So with this, I want to stop, pass the word to Paula Amadei, and wish you all a very fruitful day of conversations and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the member of the table, Edita Herda. Distinguished guest, welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. We thank Bruegel to having invited us to participate and cooperate in this forum. It's a pleasure also to cooperate again with Elcano and Giga Institute. Both of them are partner of the foundation. Sorry, especially to the interpreter. Thank you to Elcano and Giga. Both are partner of the foundation from early days. Mr. Lamo, remember that Elcano is a young institution born in 2002. We are in our infancy since we were born in 2011, so we are now entering school time. And in fact, we are starting now a new phase. The EULAC Foundation, created by the 61 member states of the EU, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the European Union, is on the path to become an international organization. We are approaching the threshold of 16 ratification of the Constitutive Act of the Foundation, which was signed just 1 year ago. So we will enter in a new phase. This morning we have a set of very interesting and distinguished panelists and keynote speakers, and you will have the opportunity to get to know them soon. At the same time, I think what makes this forum so interesting is also the fact that in the public we have compounded experience of representative of government and industry, of think tanks. So I think collectively we can have a very productive meeting. One of the advantages for us of being here in Brussels is that it's the easiest place for us to connect to our member states who have here their diplomatic representation. So here in the public, I see a lot of representatives of our member states from Latvia to Peru, from Mexico to Chile, from Haiti, Guatemala, Belize, and then indeed the partner from the European institution. So that's the ideal setting for us, as we can benefit of the joint knowledge of all these distinguished diplomats and experts. Today we have also here Ambassador Pal Vargas Koritar. Some of them may already know him, as he was for many years ambassador for his home country, Hungary, in Latin America. And he has joined the foundation in a special capacity, he's over here, as the first goodwill ambassador to the foundation. So he will help the foundation with his expertise, and especially also to promote the partnership between the two regions and the foundation in his home country. And I fully agree with Bert on the fact that the relation between Latin America, the Caribbean, and Europe is made of a number of a web of connection going through all our member states, and made of a lot of people-to-people connection and business-to-business connection. So I think one of the point that Emilio Lamo also evoked, and that will be also, we should keep in the back of our mind, is this question on why should Latin America and the Caribbean matter to Europe, and vice versa. And we are thinking, in fact, to work with Instituto Elcano and others on developing more answers to this question. Answers that for this audience are quite obvious, but that we need also to be able to convey to a larger public. And finally, I should complete thanking also the partner that allow the foundation to support events like that. In first place, the EU institution, and in this particular case also the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Portuguese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think now it's time to turn to our keynote speech, and it's my pleasure to welcome today Ambassador Edita Rda. She's the Managing Director of for the Americas and the European External Action Service of the European Union. Prior to joining the EU, she worked in the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Czech Republic's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and had various positions, including, I noted, ambassador to Argentina and Paraguay, so you know the region also from the inside, so to speak. And so thank you again for coming today and for joining us, and we very much look forward to your welcoming and your introductory, your keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you, and it's a real pleasure to see that so many people came and they have interest to talk about Latin America and Caribbean, and it's very important. I think it's important momentum. You all know that we were aiming to have a great summit with CELAC in October, that unfortunately we cannot do it, but it does not mean that we are sitting home and doing nothing. We are here with all of you, and we want to see the good, prosperous relation between European Union, Latin American, Caribbean countries, and vice versa. And I think this is very important. We always say that the relation between the countries or between the regions is not only about the governments, of course. It's about the people, about the willingness to engage, about that what we really are eager to do, and what is our conviction, it's right. So thank you for organizing this event here in Brussels. I think it's important that time to time we come together and we have the possibility to exchange not only information but also ideas, because without this we cannot really plan the future. You know, we are in a very special situation now. We are renegotiating, and we will start negotiate some new agreements with Latin America. And of course, it's a very good that I can sit here today after my last week trip to the region and say that we are progressing very well, that the negotiation with MERCOSUR is really moving forward, that it rests really only few articles in the political and cooperation part, and then we can this part conclude. And also with Mexico, we advanced very well last Friday with the negotiation, and we really aim that at least the political and cooperation part, but we very much hope that also the trade part, we could conclude the main negotiation really till the end of this year. And I think it's a very good notice for all of us, because we are meeting here today and we will speak about the multipolar relation, but based mainly on the economic relations between the two regions. And the good notice is we are progressing and there is good willingness. And of course I need to mention, and I hope that we will get very soon the consent of our council, of our member states, that we can launch the renegotiations of our agreement with Chile. So you will see that the basis for the good, prosperous future political cooperation and trade economic relations will be here, and it will be only up to us how we use these new tools and new agreements for our future. And I have to say that we are really pleased that we are opening new chapters, that these agreements are not based only on the trade, the typical one, or exchange of agriculture products, but it's really based on the future technologies. We are speaking about digital, we are speaking about the space, we are speaking about blue oceans, about all these topics which are so important now today for all of us, also in the multilateral forums. So let me turn now, again, thanking to you for organizing this event here in Brussels, to the main topic of my keynote speech. It is a bit to stress that the topic is for this conference or for this meeting is channels for a joint future. And I think it's exactly that what we want to see. And it reflects very well, as I said, our relation with Latin America. Of course, we are living in a multipolar world with certain uncertainties, challenges. Both our regions have to adapt to new situations, to the changes in politics, you said it, but also in economics. And I think it's important to take it as an opportunity for the future. Of course, and it was said this morning also, our relation is very privileged. It's privileged through the years. We have a very good, strong partnership between Latin American and Caribbean countries and European Union. Very stable one, and of course we are trying and aiming to strengthen the strategic ties now, also with all these agreements which we are negotiating and which we had negotiated in the past. What I have forgotten to mention, of course, also the relation with Caribbean will develop in the future, because we are on a renegotiation and seeing what will be the post-Cotonou. And I think this is also a very important momentum on which we have to concentrate ourselves, and you mentioned Caribbean also before here. So, of course, we need to make step forwards. Our cooperation should be based, as it was in the past, but much more in the future, on innovation, on education, and investment in the digital agenda. I think there is really the future. Of course, we had seen, if I may call it so, the golden decade commencing in 2003 in our relation, in our economies, and then, of course, some economic situation came and some setbacks. But now, again, we are on track. I can see in the dates and in the numbers that the trend of growth is here again in both regions, being it European Union, but being it also Latin America. We have seen the predicts that the growth rates are about 2.1% for year 2018. These forecasts are similar for Latin American countries and for Europe, which is very, very positive. And of course, also Europe was recovering from economic and financial crisis in the past years, and we are aiming to look for the new partnerships also. Generally speaking, of course, there is a very clear need for our economies to further work together on building resilience to the shocks which could come in the future, being it economic ones, being it the natural ones, which we have seen, for example, now in Caribbean, unfortunately, and we are very much ready to be there and helpful. And not only as European Union, but also in the cooperation in the future. We are looking with Canadians and United States what we could do together and how we could focus also on this region. Being it social problems, but including also that what is problem for both. It's crime and violence, and this is something what we have to tackle together. And of course, we need to encourage always the greater transparency and accountability. And we have heard here about shared and common values. With regard to poverty eradication and social challenges, of course, the Latin American and Caribbean countries have shown significant development in the last years and progress in these decades of the economic growth, which has contributed to lift more than 60 million people out of the poverty. And I think it's very important to tackle these. Nevertheless, of course, we should also acknowledge that inequality remains high in many of the countries, especially for women. And this is something where also many European Union programs now are looking for. Poverty levels, of course, are unfortunately back on the rise, and of course it's very much our shared challenge to promote job creation and decent work, inclusive social protection, equality, gender or citizen security, and we have seen some conferences in the past about citizen security and prosperity, and I think it's a very good way forward. And of course, this is very, very important for and essential for social cohesion. With a still modest economic recovery at stake at trade and persistent uncertainty, appropriate macroeconomic policies are key towards regaining, again, the economic dynamism and, of course, reaping for full benefits. We believe that it's very important to work on strengthening investments, savings and exports, and on fostering private sector development, and working with private sector together, private sector and governments. Promoting national and foreign investment of social and environmental quality, leading to increased trade flows, job creation, of course, very important, technology transfer, fiscal revenues, development of industries remains undoubtedly at the core of our bi-regional cooperation. In this respect, is of course important a stable and predictable and transparent regulatory framework. And it's important to attract investment and to provide legal certainty for foreign investors. Themes that appear of very strategic importance to us, on which we are ready to enhance cooperation, are regional economic integration to become more competitive, and tackling gaps in logistics and infrastructure that are important obstacles for interregional trade. According to the World Bank, average logistic costs are 3 to 4 times higher than in OECD countries, which is a very important figure, I think. And this enables the economies of the region to be less dependent on the variation of the world economy and political choice of their partner, and it will attract more EU investment in it without any doubt. Improving productivity remains, of course, key challenge, not only for Europe, but also for Latin American countries and Caribbean. And I think that productivity is a key driver for more solid and sustained long-term growth. All European and Latin American Caribbean businesses and representatives say the same. They need more investment to the digital agenda, on vocational training, higher education, on infrastructures. That's what we hear in all our discussions all around. Strengthening productivity requires reasonable length of time, but I believe without any doubt that European Union and Latin American countries should reflect on this together, and we should reflect on some priority sectors as the ones that I just mentioned, and maybe more would come here from the discussion, but also on such as sustainable and circular urban economy. And you know that Latin America and cities in Latin America are very challenging for all of us, and I think it was clearly seen during the Habitat meeting that it's something where we can very well work all together. And of course, knowledge economy. This, I think, there is our future. With regard to digital challenges, there's certainly a strong and reciprocal interest what we see to invest in digital economy as a crucial force for boosting structural changes. making progress and to reduce inequalities. In social economic inclusion, again, speaking about the possibilities for women empowerment. We know that internet connectivity is transforming the way government, public organizations, the societies are working and thinking. And I have to say the digital economy needs to address the boost productivity, sustainable development and intensive growth and job creation again. Looking at the changes in the digital sphere, yesterday we had a very good debate with IBM here in Brussels about the future, about transatlantic relations. What the representatives of IBM see as a possibility for transatlantic relation, but if we are speaking about transatlantic relation, I want to say something here which is very important. Transatlantic relation does not mean only United States. Transatlantic relation includes, of course, Latin American countries and Caribbean because of the Atlantic there. And I think we need to stress this especially in these days and foster this relation, cross-Atlantic relation, and to see if there are any more possibilities to focus in this area. On urban challenges, again, coming back to it, the fact is that Latin America is the world's most urbanized region, as I was mentioning. And of course, I have here a very interesting number that by 2050, 90% of Latin American population will be in towns, which is quite interesting also from the development comparing to that what is happening in Europe. And there is no doubt that urban issues will increasingly dominate to the region politics in the future. So I think that's also a topic where we have to concentrate ourselves in the future. And of course, there is European Union know-how. We can assist in many processes of urban development, and we could share our experiences and knowledges with the region. Being it economic opportunities, being it in services, health issues, but also something which is important for us in Europe is kind of decentralization and citizen participation. Growth alone won't be enough, I have to say, to maintain social gains and to, in the future, reduce persistent inequalities, being it here and being it in Latin American countries and Caribbean. I think that very important is investment in education, vocational training, firm-based education, and the life skills. This is what remains the decisive factor for the growth. For the people to be integrated in the society, again, it's valid for European Union, but I think it's valid also for other regions. And you see how much we do stress in these days the importance of all our programs and projects for the youth, being it studying plans, being it funds for supporting education, because education, this is really basic issue for European Union countries. And of course, innovation, a key to increase output and productivity, is a very important driver of us. My last point here would be coming a bit back from the region to the multi-sphere and tackle two important countries which play important role also for us and for our relation. And they were mentioned here already partially, and it's influence of United States and China. With regard to the challenges in US trade and immigration policies, which contribute to a range of risks around Latin American countries, but also Caribbean economies, Mexico, Central America, and we were speaking about it here. It's certainly something what we have to have in mind when we plan our future and our future collaboration. Of course, we see also this step back from NAFTA, these TPP problems. they are creating new momentums in Latin American countries, but they are also creating new momentums for us, because don't forget that we had TTIP, which was almost negotiated but never concluded. So we need to look for other partners. We need to look at what is happening, of course. We need to reflect whatever is happening, but I think it's good momentum to look in the future in our relation. And of course, China's economic and trade engagement in Latin America means also something for European Union. It grew significantly around the year 2000. And of course, the expanding, the being present, it brings us to a bit vindicate and to see where the possibilities for European Union are, and if there are possibilities to go back to back with these strong economies. Of course, maybe I don't need to repeat that there is a strong willingness from the side of European Union to strengthen the partnership with Latin American and Caribbean countries, with the region, that we want to promote innovative forms for our relation, being it in climate change, energy, transports, telecommunications, small and medium enterprises, etc., etc. So I think what is needed is a dialogue. It's a conversation. It's thinking about our future, our common future, and I think it is important to strengthen it. It's thinking about common future. Thank you very much.
So I think we still have 1 or 2 minutes for 1 or 2 questions. So if anybody would like to address a question to the ambassador, please raise your hand. Okay, I see. Oh no, here we have a first question. It's always the first question of the day. So it's thank you for volunteering.
I was hoping there would be nothing.
I'm happy to be a volunteer. I'm Miguel Diaz. I'm a Foreign Service spouse. I used to head the Latin American program at CSIS in Washington. In the United States, we periodically, every 4 years, we talked about strengthening the relationship with Latin America. And we always thought in terms first of grand plans like trade agreements and so on. And we tended to overlook the opportunity offered by the Latin American community in the United States. There are 40 million Hispanics who are citizens and maybe 10 million more who are not citizens. There is a consequential number of Latinos in Europe, and you notice it in Brussels. And I wonder to what extent the EU is giving attention to this community in terms of bridging the ties between Europe and Latin America.
Question, otherwise we would turn back to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. It's a bit tricky question, but as I said, that the relation between the countries and the regions is based on the relation between the people, and you can hardly avoid to be in touch and collaborate with the Latinos, being it here and being it there, because the numbers are growing. I was living for 5 years in New York, and you could see it was quite good phenomena. My mother, who spoke Spanish only because we were in Argentina, and she landed and she speaks Spanish and German. She came to visit me, and during her first visit, she was walking through Manhattan, very desperate, and then she came smiling, laughing, saying, "Oh, this great city." I said, "Why? What happened? What changed this approach, And she said, "Come on, I know, I can speak Spanish. Everybody understands me." So you see, that's it. And I think you don't really distinguish, but you focus on something. And of course, when we are acting as European Union, you have not to forget that European Union, that's European Union and the member states. And even many member states, they are in United States and in different states, and we approach the local communities, but also the European ones, you know, not only the Latin American ones. So I think it's important to speak about European Union, Latin American relation also in United States and Canada. And that's why I am really looking forward and a good cooperation with the Canadians. We invited them, by the way, to our last seminar on gender in Buenos Aires. It was a CELAC meeting, but the Canadians took participation was there. And we are thinking also to work with the US administration on some issues regarding Latin America. So there we are now.
Perhaps just to mention it, I'm very happy about the question. When we organized the seminar, we put up a special session dedicated to this diaspora relevance of Latin Americans living in Europe and vice versa. It's not as pressing, but that is especially part of the session number 3, which we have today. And so People Challenge, that is precisely because we also find that a very important item on the agenda of EU-LAC relations. So more to come.
Okay, so I think this concludes our first session, and we are now moving to the second session. And may I ask all the panelists and keynote speakers for the second session to come here, and please join me in thanking again all the speakers here on the panel.
Hello, hello, hello. Can I ask you to, well, this is... Hello. We do want to ask you to take your seats again. Hello. We want to ask you to take your seats again. Can anybody hear me? Please take your seats again. Thank you. We want to continue with the conference. This feels like a coffee break. However, we haven't got a coffee break in the program for the moment. We will have a coffee break after this session. So I would like everybody to come back and join us for this session where we do have a distinguished set of speakers on the issue. First, we start with the trade and investment relations. We already had an introduction, so I will not make a big new introduction to that. Just as a reminder, we spoke about the shared ties, shared traditions, histories, relations, and it was highlighted by Guntram Wolf how big of an investment hub Latin America is for Europe, and that is for a long time. Just one item on this, Sao Paulo is the biggest German industrial city, so to speak, outside of Germany. Nowhere else, not in China, is there such a presence of German manufacturing industries there. And also, if we think of Mexico, we spoke about Trump. I think Trump's policies or rhetoric against versus Mexico has also highlighted European leaders go to Mexico and reassert the European commitment to Mexico as a place for trade, for political alliance, but also as a place for European investments. So without further ado, I would want to pass the floor to our distinguished speakers. We will have a keynote by Eduardo Levi Yeyati, if I pronounce that right, more or less, okay? He's the Dean at the University Torquato di Italia School of Government in Argentina, which reminds us that if we speak about EU-Latin American relations, these are always part of the broader global relations. Argentina will be hosting the next G20, which we had been hosting this year in Hamburg. So good luck with that. We were not always very lucky with all side effects of it. But without further ado, please, Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for the invitation. For all of you that are soccer fans, you probably know that it was a very long night for Argentina. We qualified for the World Cup at 4:30 p.m. approximately. So I'm happy and tired. It's very interesting, very important for us, for me as an Argentinian, to be here discussing this, because if there is one country right now that is really keen on nailing a long negotiated agreement with the EU, is Argentina. I think we are really hopeful that we will at least reach the first stage of an agreement with the EU within this year. And it's been discussed. It's an issue, really. It's a policy issue. It's something that we really aspire to. So it's important to highlight the pros and the obstacles to move forward and deepen those agreements. That's going to be the focus of my brief presentation. Let me see if this works. It doesn't. I have a presentation here. There, thanks. Okay, first of all, before starting the presentation, something that we need to understand. We usually talked about Latin America, but conceptually there are more than one Latin America. You might think, simplifying somehow, that there are at least two: the commodity exporting Latin America, South America particularly, the commodity importing Central America, Mexico, which is in between. It's probably the only quasi-manufacturing country. And it used to be a commodity exporter, but not anymore because of the oil exports been declining recently. And then we have Venezuela. So for instance, if we want to sort of present in a chart something about Latin America, we have to choose. And some of the charts that I will be showing choose what we call LAC 6, which are the 7 largest Latin American countries, South American countries plus Mexico minus Venezuela. So what I'm trying to say is that my some of the concepts that we'll be talking about in this presentation are focusing particularly in the commodity exporting group, which is the largest one. If you look at Latin America as a whole, a weighted average of whatever you measure there will be dominated by this group because these are the largest countries. And there is a bias then in what I'm going to say, because I'm coming from Argentina, probably I will be paying more attention to that group than to, say, Central America. Now, having said that, we are in an interesting situation here when we talk about negotiating trade agreements in Latin America, and particularly looking this from the perspective of MERCOSUR. We want to integrate, I mean, there is a shift, particularly in MERCOSUR, in policies towards more integration, openness. On the one hand, the other one, we are in a context where trade links and trade movements are declining. This chart here is only one way of showing how world trade has been plateauing and to some extent declining in recent years. I think I have to ask people to change. Yeah, exactly. This is another way of looking at that. And so we are entering an opening quest in a context in which openness is being questioned. That actually puts much more emphasis on the importance of particular trade agreements, in particular with the EU, because it's one of the few great opportunities that we have to show this change in policy. We are also coming from, not only MERCOSUR, South America in general, we are coming from a situation in which our countries are comparatively closed. And this is important to emphasize the pattern, the trade pattern, and how this links with growth patterns in Latin America, and particularly South America. South American countries are generally very close. They are commodity exporters and manufacturing importers. And every now and then, and for the past decades, they have been facing a stop-and-go dynamic by which, whenever they grow, since import elasticity to income is relatively high, whenever we grow, we start building up a trade imbalance that cannot be fixed easily with a devaluation because our exports, since they are commodity exports, are relatively inelastic. So whenever we have a trade imbalance, if we devalue, we correct this imbalance by contracting the economy, by reducing imports rather than expanding exports. Saying this in a very different and simpler way, we have a hard time finding new exports and finding new markets. And that's one of the key issues why we are so interested in opening up. Now, this comes with a con, because if we open up, the first reaction, the immediate reaction will be the following. We'll be selling more of the same, and we will be probably importing much more than the additional exports that we have. If we analyze, for instance, the EU agreement from the perspective of MERCOSUR, at least in the first years, we will be widening our trade deficit with the EU in general. So as you see, we're facing a conundrum. We want to open up, and we need to generate new markets, but we need to generate new exports as well. Only exporting more commodities to the world, and particularly to the EU, will not be enough to get away from this external trap or external sector trap. There is another thing that probably reflects the same thing I was mentioning before when we look at Latin America and the EU, and this also will be, this chart will be exactly, or pretty much the same if we focus only on South American countries. There is a traveling asymmetry between the EU and Latin America. There is an asymmetry that in the very nice presentation, actually, you all have, that was prepared by my very good friend Alicia Garcia Herrero, was emphasized as a good thing. We have compatibility between the Latin America and the EU, because what we export, you import, and vice versa. Now, this compatibility is, as I mentioned before, accompanied by this asymmetry. We are a trade deficit region in general, whereas Europe as a whole is a trade surplus region, and that asymmetry is also reflected in our bilateral, interregional trade, which has been widening its deficit in the recent years. I mean, we have a deficit with the EU, and if we deepen our relations, the first reaction will be to widen that deficit. That doesn't mean that that shouldn't discourage the agreement, but these are things that are being discussed and are typically obstacles to the agreement. And that's why the negotiations, for instance, between MERCOSUR and the European Union has been focused essentially how many commodities can we export to Europe, and the key aspect, although there are many other issues that have been discussed, the key aspect is how much grains or primary products we can export without tariffs to the EU. And this is exactly the point that's under discussion right now in Buenos Aires. We have received the offer, and we are seeing whether we can accept this, or we will come with a counteroffer. Now, as I mentioned before, this is, if we want to characterize Latin American growth, this is probably one of the best ways to show it. Whenever we start growing, and if you look at this, is essentially describing the last 15 years. When we started growing by the beginning of the 2000s, we went from a trade deficit at the beginning, coming from a crisis and a huge devaluation, and from a contraction of our imports through a contraction of GDP. And then as we started growing, we started building up a trade deficit. The trade deficit is the red bar. And the trade deficit was interrupted briefly during the crisis because we contracted the GDP. We devalued and contracted GDP. As I mentioned, whenever we devalued, our balance of payment correction is through imports and weaker activity. But then again, the trend was revived in recent years. The improvement in last year essentially is almost entirely due to Brazil, because Brazil had a deep contraction and imports went down, and since this is a weighted average, Brazil is very important here. But most of our countries are in deficit, and if we grow, as Argentina is growing right now, you will see the widening of this deficit. Again, the question of how fast can you grow without over-indebting the country, or without facing this external constraint. How much can we move forward without finding new exports, so to speak? What to export is essential to us. One thing that we have, I mentioned before, and I think we have to bear in mind when we talk about Argentina and Latin America, is that we have this grains versus machinery, grains for cars, a type of trade. There are numbers here. I mean, I don't want to go over them because we don't have so much time. But the bottom line is that whereas there is compatibility here, we see at the end of my talk, this grain for cars or grains for manufacturers, a type of trade deal, is something that has potentially very negative consequences, social and economic consequences for Latin America. It's something that should be, over the years, amended. We have to think how to get out of this very simple compatibility trade that in itself creates problems for Latin American countries. I will come back to that in a moment. Let me move forward. Okay, so simply to, no, this is not the one, hold on. No, let's move forward. Okay. This is another aspect I want to emphasize when we look at our relationship, the degree of closeness that our countries, and particularly the MERCOSUR countries, exhibit vis-à-vis other countries in the world and in Europe in particular. We need to bring our trade, our export and imports to the level of, say, Chile or Mexico, and that's, I imagine, that's probably the key objective of building new relationship. And as I mentioned before, that's probably the key issue when we look at the need for Argentina to negotiate an agreement with Europe very rapidly. Yeah. Now, I mentioned that we have a trade deficit. The question here is, if we look at this type of agreement from a very long-term perspective, we have to figure out how to undo this deficit over time. And that's something that is related in part with the possibility to have FDI from Europe or for other countries to build up new things to export. But it's also, as I mentioned before, negatively tied with the nature of our trade with Europe. In particular, in Mercosur country, we have to bear in mind the following. I mean, we tend to think of Latin America as a commodity exporting country, but in Brazil and Argentina, as well as in Mexico, there is a non-trivial manufacturing basis that is very important in creating new jobs. So it's not an there is a key difference between Chile and Argentina. Chile doesn't have a manufacturing base. It's opening up to manufacturing imports, doesn't hit so much the labor demand and activity. In Argentina, we're still hoping to revive our manufacturing. It doesn't seem likely that the manufacturing shops will increase in the future because labor productivity will probably grow at the expense of labor demand, but still there is always the resistance, political resistance, but also with good reason to open up very rapidly and wipe out what is still a very active and potentially competitive industrial basis. So that's probably one of the reasons, if not the key reason, for the length of this negotiation between the EU and Mercosur. The other one being, of course, the possibility, the restrictions to export our commodities to the EU. Let me conclude by, let me emphasize one more thing that's important. I mean, if you look at this chart, the thing that comes up is that Latin America and Mercosur, countries like Argentina in particular, have been receiving very low, relatively very low FDI inflows. And we are as a region a group of countries that have very low investment ratios. And we have been facing sort of a middle income trap where we cannot, over the long run, grow more than 2-3% per year, 1-2% per capita over a long run basis. So we have a link, there is a link between the need to invest more, the need to to fund this investment from abroad, and as a result, the need to receive more FDI, since the EU is generally the main source of FDI. This is one of the key attractions for the regions to approach the EU and reach an agreement. So FDI coming from the EU is essential to compensate whatever we can lose in terms of trade deficits. It's something that we have to keep in mind, particularly in countries like Argentina, where we are engaged in a huge public infrastructure projects that we have to found somewhere in the private sector through PPP agreements, because we are facing a fiscal deficit we have to contain. So on this front, I think FDI is probably a good point to compensate the concerns about the trade deficit. This is simply showing that the EU is essentially the key source from FDI for the region. There are investments from the regions in the EU, but essentially are accounted almost entirely by Brazilian FDI into the EU. Our region is not an FDI source typically. I had another one, but I forgot to include it. But let me conclude, and this is important, that let me introduce an issue that is not entirely related with trade, but it's something that I think will be essential in moving forward with our agreements. I think it's likely we'll reach an agreement this year, but we still have many steps to go to deepen that into a real increase in our trade links. Now, there is in the region, in particular in Mercosur, a link to some of the aspects I mentioned before. There is a side to the problem is essentially related with the labor problem. We have in the region, and particularly in countries where the manufacturing sector is important in the creation of jobs, we are facing a labor problem. We have difficulties in creating new jobs. Our more dynamic sectors are typically very very low labor, have very low labor intensity. Primary sectors, infrastructures are the drivers of growth in many of these countries. We have a manufacturing basis that is, if it wants to survive the opening of their economies, it needs to import capital, and that means eliminating jobs. And so we have to rely on the service sector, which usually is not entirely, it doesn't entirely compensate for the loss of jobs in other quarters. Opening up eliminates jobs. And that's how this is factored by policymakers and how, including the policy debate in countries like Argentina or Brazil. How many jobs are we going to lose if we open up to EU manufacturers or to the world in general? And that's why there is such a tight grip on imports, even though the speech and the will to open is very earnest, is very sincere. I think when we think of integration, we have to introduce this labor dimension that is compounded by the fact that many of the countries are actually facing in the next few years a demographic bonus that put them in a position to create even more jobs to take advantage of this bonus. So the labor aspect, I think, even more than the trade balance aspect, is one thing that might, be an obstacle in coming years when we want to deepen these relations. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. I think it's an important issue that you mentioned the labor side. We don't have a specific session to it, but I think we have to keep that in mind. We have now 4 speakers and limited time, so I have to ask all speakers to be concise because we do want to have your input, but also the discussion with the audience. So the next speaker will be Paulo Carreño King, the Director General of Pro Mexico. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bert, Miguel, Mario, Ambassadors Gonzalo and Everton Vargas, Eduardo. Certainly, it's a pleasure to join you at this panel. I'll try to be concise as possible, but I will, speaking on behalf of, in this case, of Mexico, with your permission, Ambassador, it's great to see you again. I have to say, regarding what we have shared, Mexico found and chose a path of a free trade a couple of decades ago. Since then, our country has changed completely, not just in economic terms, its institutional life and the social landscape. Right now, Mexico is part of 12 free trade agreements that gave us access to 46 countries, to 46 economies. And in this trend, we found ourselves as well, and in a very complex context, as you know, not just as a country, but as a part of a region, as Eduardo mentioned, or several regions, in this case, North America, but also Latin America. Mexico is in the same context trying to deal with 3 main challenges. One certainly is NAFTA. I think we have spoken lengthy here about the process in which we are in the modernization and in the renegotiation of NAFTA. The other is, the Pacific Alliance as well, what we have built with Peru, with Colombia, and Chile, and as well the horizon that we'll see to complement, for example, with former TPP countries, or the TPP 11 as it is mentioned, and as well the renegotiation processes that we have with the European Union. apart from that, we need to join other countries as well in the challenges of how to deal with the current debate of free trade versus isolation. This is a debate of great relevance for our policy crafters as well, for makers. We need to pay attention, certainly not just on the benefits that free trade has brought to Mexico, as Eduardo mentioned, not just from bringing Mexico into a process from primary exports to manufacture and what we have right now as advanced manufacture, but also to deal with and clearly identify the advantages of shortcomings derived from trade openness. For example, mitigate negative effects of trade, adapt technology to be an ally and not an obstacle. We believe, for example, and this is something that ProMexico as a trade agency and investment is doing, for example, how to deal with automation, and also certainly to adapt to new trends of commerce. Regarding NAFTA, we do believe that we need to first have a shared assessment of what we have built with our two main partners, Canada and the United States. Second, have a recognition that there is room for modernization. It must include new disciplines, for example, e-commerce and intellectual property. And thirdly, have a win-win proposition in a timely manner. As you know, Mexico has presidential elections next year. The United States also will have an electoral process that will make very difficult to reach and to maintain agreements in these negotiations. And if these conditions are not met, we believe as well that we have several options, and we must analyze all these options. So I would just like to conclude this first participation by saying that Mexico is in this path of an open free market. It will continue to do so, and that's pretty much what the government of President Enrique Peña Nieto has done with the structural reforms that has promoted. Create a better business environment for foreign direct investment, create a better business environment for exports, promotions of products and services from Mexico, and also the internationalizations of some of the Mexican companies. Thank you, Bert.
Okay, thank you very much, Paulo, also for the really being concise. I think we get back to issues like NAFTA in the debate, I suppose. I would pass the word to Gonzalo Gutierrez, Ambassador of Peru to Belgium, Luxembourg, and of course to the European Union. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hoffman. I will try to be very much to the point, with 2 or 3 very simple ideas that we feel that are relevant. We are talking here a little bit about the geopolitics, how the relationship between CELAC, or the countries of CELAC, and the European Union are part of a strategic alliance. And my first question is, are we really strategic partners? Should we reflect on that? Because since, when was 2013, we have these summits between Europe and CELAC, and we have reached agreement in many areas. But could we say that those agreements has been translated in concrete measures in terms of a strategic relationship between the 2 regions? And here, somebody very wisely said before that the friendship the relationship between Europe and Latin America is not only trade and investment. That's absolutely true. It's not only trade and investment, but it has to have trade and investment. And I was watching some figures here. For instance, the trade of Latin America with the European Union in 2014 fell to 265 billion from 265 billion from 275 billion the year before. So we have a decline in the exports, especially from Latin America to Europe. This, the explanation of this decline is mainly Brazil. Brazil is quite important in our region, and Brazil experienced a diminish of around $10 billion in their trade. Same thing happened with Argentina, same thing happened with Chile and Peru. So if we see this, could we say that the relationship between the two regions is based on the agreements that we have on the strategic alliance, or it's mainly based on the regular trends of the international economy? Are we putting an additional element into our bi-regional relationship with the agreements that we are taking, or we are just following the general trends? And I'm a little bit afraid to answer that maybe it's only the general trend and not necessarily special relationship. And there is where we have to act, because this trade between Europe and Latin America, as it was very well explained before, it's mainly in traditional goods, in commodities. Are we introducing in this special relationship a new kind of trade, a new kind of investment? One of the previous speakers mentioned China. Little by little, and I talk with a little bit of experience, but because I spent 3 years as ambassador to China, and little by little, China is becoming a larger and larger investor and trader with many countries in Latin America. The experience that we have in Peru is that China now, for instance, in the main productive area of our country, which is the minerals, China is now the main foreign investor. And this is why. My own explanation is they do have a design. They have a view, how to become global, how to influence in other regions, how to extend what they call the soft power. Does Europe has the same concept, idea, image? That's a question that maybe we can talk about later, but it's necessary for Europe to have this idea of how to relate with Latin America. We recognize that maybe the two regions that have more in common are Europe and Latin America in the world. We have same views, same traditions, same economic, juridical systems, same view of the world. But we still don't have a clear and path to follow as the one that, for instance, China is putting on the table. And this goes through some measures that should be taken in terms of increase the investment, but also to direct the investment and trade. We have to move out of the exchange of raw materials by manufactured products. The investment should try to focus as well in developing, as Edita Herda said very wisely, knowledge economy and digital economy in Latin America, not only from one side to the other, but up by regional economic and investment relationship. There's another problem that I see in our relationship. This need to have a geopolitical global view towards Latin America not necessarily is reflected in the day-by-day, especially trade relationship between our groups. Yesterday night I was talking with some of my colleagues from MERCOSUR. I heard here that, well, everything is going okay, that we are finishing. Well, not the same tone that my friends from MERCOSUR said yesterday, related especially to the agricultural offer. They say they are going like, como el cangrejo, they say in Latin America, going backwards. So even in that, at that level, in our negotiations, there should be a political message that we are willing to reach an agreement. In the case of MERCOSUR, it's quite important because that would, in a way, complete the relationship between Latin America and Europe. To the best of my knowledge, if the agreement with MERCOSUR is finished, only 3 countries in Latin America wouldn't have a trade agreement with Europe, which would be Bolivia, Cuba, and Venezuela. So that would mean that mostly, and I hope those 3 countries in the near future can also join this effort, would have a common corpus of norms, legislation, trade arrangements that may improve this view of a common goal in our 2 regions. And finally, at the same level, in this work relationship, we should be very much aware of the need to avoid the non-tariff limitations. In the case of regulations in areas like sanitary or phytosanitary subjects, most probably some of our countries are now facing what we may feel as a protectionist barriers. Not anymore in terms of the regular trade, the regular tariffs, but in new areas where it's becoming more and more difficult for us to participate in a swift and diversified trade between Latin America and Europe. These are my very few and to the point comments on our bi-regional relationship. But it's important for us to reflect on this. It's important that we move ahead in our bilateral mechanisms, but it's also important not to be in love just with our declarations, but also trying to translate what we have in those very important declarations that we have since 2013 into real-world actions that give content to the relationship, the bi-regional relationship between Europe and Latin America. Thank you very much, Bert.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think very pointed, very provocative points you raise. I'm tempted to respond, but that would exceed the role of moderator at the moment. I would pass it for now to Miguel Otero, who is Senior Analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute. And the floor is yours, Miguel.
Thanks, Bert. I'm going to try to be as telegraphic as possible as well. I have 5 points. It's great to be here and discuss what the European Union and Latin American countries can do together. As you know, from the Elcano Institute, that is very close to our work, and we try to contribute to the debate as much as possible. The first point that I have is that we really have now a window of opportunity. With the arrival of Trump, with the change of governments in countries as important as Argentina and Brazil, with the collapse of TPP, the collapse of TTIP, with the renegotiation of NAFTA. This is really kind of a conjuncture that we have right now where Latin America and the European Union, and we've seen it from political statements of some of the leaders, that they really should go forward in further integration. So I think, you know, we really should take this opportunity. The second is, and we have done some work on this, and we will publish it soon. It's a report led by Carlos Maramut, who I guess most of you know in this room, and it is entitled, Why Does Latin America Matter? We believe that in Brussels, not many people have understood the importance of Latin America, and we tried in a succinct, relatively succinct, 70, 80-page report to try to explain to the people interested in this city, but overall in the European Union, why we think Latin America matters. It is an economy of $4.5 trillion, more than Germany. The granularity of and this was mentioned before, of the exchanges on all levels, not only in trade and investment, but as well on social relations, on cultural relations, on people-to-people relations, is on migration levels, etc. I think one of the things that we've experienced again, over the past years is that again, people in Latin America would see Spanish people coming to work in Latin America, seeking jobs, and and this has been a pattern continuously over the past hundreds of years. But I think it's important to as well to put a level playing field of saying, look, at the end of the day, these are cycles, and sometimes some people come, and sometimes the other people from the other side of the Atlantic come over. 600 million people. I don't have to tell you about the resources, just to tell you that almost 1/3 of all the water resources are in the region. On investment, the European Union invests in Latin America more than in China, India, and Russia combined. So therefore, we see as well kind of another movement. We have the multilatinas, the multinational corporations from Latin America in Europe. 55 of the top 500 multinational corporations in the world are Latin American. So therefore, I think sometimes we take Latin America for granted, or we think, okay, it's there, we do a lot with it, but we don't see, and going a bit back to Gonzalo's point, we don't really see the strategic importance of Latin America, the role that Latin America can play in shaping the future of global capitalism. And of course, when we talk about the future of global capitalism, we have to talk about China. And China is now a major player in a lot of different regions in the world, and is, as you all know, becoming a very important player in Latin America. Based on the commodity boom that we had in the noughties, 75% of exports from Latin America to China are as well. I mean, we are talking, and Eduardo did this very, very eloquently, that at the end of the day, we are following the same pattern that is asymmetric and that is troublesome, which is Latin America exporting commodities and primary goods, and the European Union exporting manufactured goods, etc. But you have the same pattern with China. Right? To the extent that, I mean, at some point, some people were saying that places like Brazil were hit and had a phase of deindustrialization because of all the manufactured goods that were coming from China. So this is a new player, a player that, of course, concentrates a lot of the investment in certain countries. Just to give you a few figures as well here, most of the investment, or most of the trade, 60% of trade of China with Latin America is with Brazil, Mexico, and Chile. 80% of all Chinese investment in Latin America is in Brazil, Peru, and Argentina. And 90% of all the public loans are in Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, and Ecuador, and Bolivia. Most of them as well in specific sectors: infrastructure, energy, related to, I guess, the needs and the competitive advantages of China. And this is a big debate, whether China is a positive factor. We believe at the Institute that it is a positive factor, that Latin America receives Chinese money, receives Chinese investments. As you know, Spain is one of the biggest investors in the region. We don't really see China as its competitor. There are many cases where collaboration is happening. And we are as well appreciating that, I think Europe in particular, and Spain, Europe in general and Spain in particular, has to say that we will be the hub, or that we will be like some sort of bridge between China and Latin America. This is an outdated metaphor for us, should not really continue, but certainly there is collaboration needed. Spain has a lot of experience in Latin America. China has money that wants to invest in Latin America, and there we see as well that the Chinese are, which is a very traditional way from China, trial and error. Okay, they have done a lot of errors. There are a lot of investments went belly up, but they are learning from them, and they are realizing that, okay, they need maybe to engage with partners that know the region more. Maybe they need as well to engage with the populations that sometimes are, discontent about this particular investment. And so we are seeing as well that China is moving away slowly from only commodities to other sectors, where China as well kind of is with its expertise on manufacturing. And this goes to Eduardo's question, right? I mean, ultimately, the big question about Latin America, but this is not only for Latin America, this is as well, a discussion we have in Spain, is what's going to be the growth model, the productive model of these countries for the next 50 years? That's the big question that all of us have. And we discuss it a lot with our Latin American peers, economies, and I insist always on the same idea. It's a very basic idea, but, it's about education, education, education. That's a problem that we have in our countries, and we can blame others, but this is something that we can only resolve in our own countries, which is how we build education systems ready for people to have the skills and competences needed to be competitive at the global level in the next 50 years. This is a major, major issue, but I think we need to put our efforts there in cooperation with our partners. Fourth point, very quickly, and this was mentioned as well by Gonzalo, I think we are operating in this, it was said as well by the European Union, in this wider Atlantic region. We share values, we share political systems, we share an attitude. We believe very strongly that Latin America is as well part of the West, sometimes forgotten by some people, especially north of the Rio Grande. We disagree, though, in what should be, with certain countries especially, what should be the relation between the state and market. Okay, the eternal political economy question of, if you want to go into development, in certain types of development, what role for the state, what role for the market in this development? And I think, again, there we should try to overcome the ideological trenches that we have built over the years, try to be a bit more pragmatic, and perhaps try to understand each other more. I think, again, there we have a window of opportunity. Even the IMF has said that perhaps we went too far with the liberal order. My director has written that for a lot of Latin Americans, the liberal order means US hegemony, and people feel uncomfortable with it. And therefore, I think here, and China is an interesting case, okay? It's an interesting case of how do you do development while keeping, from our point of view, a liberal, plural political system, right? Again, big questions that we need to tackle together. Finally, and I know that Bert is pressing me, on MERCOSUR negotiations, I think it's disappointing that the European Union has offered something that is even lower than it was offered in 2004. I mean, that has to be said, and I think we don't really go far if we are so short-sighted in our perspectives. And my thing, and I finish here, you know, I could talk about the importance as well of Latin America in the multilateral setting, in the G20, with 3 countries there, you know, the wider debate about, you know, the world order. But concretely, I have the feeling, and this is, I think, a shared feeling by many, is that we are now trying to finish the negotiations of a treaty for the 20th century, for the 21st century. Okay? This is a treaty about trade mostly, but it is not a new generation treaty that should be really the focus of these big regions. Where is there digitalization? Where is there telecommunications? Where are there other services? Where is the education? Where is there climate change? You know, where is labor? And, you know, what do we do with labor? With automation, with a lot of challenges that come our way. I mean, are these really the rules we want for the next 30 years, again, for the both regions? Or are these archaic rules of the 20th century for the 21st century challenges? I leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Miguel. Again, very thought-provoking and I hope stimulating for the debate. Before we come to the Ambassador Everton Vargas, Ambassador of Brazil to the European Union, Brazil has been mentioned a few times. Give us your picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bert. And thank you for the invitation to be here before such a distinguished audience. In my intervention, I will focus primarily on Brazil, MERCOSUR, and EU relations. And I should like to make 3 points, basically. First, Brazil and the EU have a common interest in preserving the global economic order at this moment of unprecedented challenges. Second, the deep and intense economic ties that unite Brazil and the EU are not a given. They have been built over the years. This means both sides need to invest in this partnership if it is to retain its value for Brazil and the EU. And third, an EU-MERCOSUR association agreement presently being negotiated could ensure that our bilateral relations remain solid going forward. Let me begin by the first point. It is hard to identify another moment in real history when the international order established in the aftermath of World War II has faced a challenge of such a magnitude as it does today. These challenges come from the top, from actors that question the relevance of the international order, but also from below, from segments of society that believe that opening up to more international integration leads to unemployment, loss of their living standards, and environmental degradation. This is a defining moment when actors should join forces to preserve and possibly improve the institutions and rules that have guaranteed stability and prosperity in the past years. This is the moment to make the case for multilateralism. Brazil and the EU have a strong track record of defending the rules-based economic order. We see the value it has in ultimately improving people's lives. Our bilateral cooperation permitted the adoption of groundbreaking decisions such as one that called for fully eliminating the export agricultural subsidies during the WTO Nairobi Ministerial Conference in 2015. Brazil and the EU are working together to ensure a successful WTO conference in Buenos Aires next December. In the lead-up to Buenos Aires, we have submitted a proposal to discipline domestic support for farmers, thus avoiding distortions in international trade. In short, Brazil and the EU converge on a number of areas that need to be addressed by the global trade regime in order to make it work for all. But we also share a number of deeper values which underpin and should underpin international trade. For instance, Brazil joined Argentina and EU at the UN General Assembly this year to endorse a proposal to end trade in goods used in torture and capital punishment. Economic integration and openness have benefited both Brazil and Europe. The following facts and figures may sound counterintuitive, but they reveal just how dense the economic relations between Brazil and the EU are. Brazil is the 5th largest investor in the EU. Our stock of investment in the EU is 127 billion euros, is larger than that of China. Brazilian companies generate jobs and innovation in the EU in a number of ways, such as through the manufacture of airplanes and engines. The EU is the largest investor in Brazil, with a stock of 327 billion euros, as far as 2015 is concerned. Last year, Brazil was the main destination of EU's global investment flows, 33 billion euros, notwithstanding the economic crisis. This is no mean feat, as the EU is the largest investor in the world. Some facts demonstrate just how strong the economic integration between Brazil and EU is. São Paulo hosts one of the largest concentrations of German businesses in the world. Over 900 German-Brazilian companies are there. São Paulo is also the second largest Swedish industrial hub after Gothenburg. Brazil often provides a relevant, if not the largest, share of the profits for European countries. We are the third largest market for beauty and cosmetic products in the world. Brazil and the EU's convergent views on the global economic order draw on this deep integration between our economies and societies. These are just some of the reasons why Brazil and EU are strategic partners. It's a partnership between two global actors which, in 2017, celebrates its 10th anniversary. But this partnership is the result of a joint and continuous construction over the years. It was not a given. In order to remain at its dense level, constant investment is required. At this defining moment of global rearrangements at many levels, it is our responsibility to preserve the acquis of the Brazil-EU relations. And here is where geopolitics, or perhaps more appropriately, geoeconomics comes in. A number of ongoing shifts at the local, regional, and global levels may affect how Brazil interacts with the global economy in the near future. These shifts might also have an impact on Brazil-EU economic relations. At the domestic level, Brazil is currently implementing much-needed reforms aimed at putting in place conditions for economic growth and competitiveness. Ultimately, these reforms seek to provide, in a sustainable manner, jobs, education, and decent living standards for the Brazilian people. Some of the measures already being put in place, such as concessions for infrastructure, will lead to an increased internationalization of the Brazilian economy. Just a couple of weeks ago, for instance, hydropower generation plants have been granted to companies from China and France, and earlier this year, bids for 4 airports were won by operators from France, Germany, and Switzerland. Brazil has traditionally ranked as one of the top 10 destinations for foreign investment in the world, but with measures being put in place, the investment flow to Brazil in 2017 is expected to reach a very significant volume, with estimates ranging around $8 billion. On the trade front, in 2017, China became our #1 trading partner. This means the EU, which has traditionally held this place, is now in second place. And this seems to be the trend that will not only intensify, since the gap in trade volume between Brazil and China and Brazil and EU is already sizable. Also on trade, along with MERCOSUR countries, Brazil has begun negotiating a trade agreement with EFTA. On Monday, Brazil and Canada announced the decision to start a joint exercise to define the scope with a view to possible negotiations on free trade. And we are also working to expand our preferential trade agreement with India. In Latin America, MERCOSUR has increased its collaboration with the Pacific Alliance countries, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, in a movement that will further contribute to the economic integration of the region. Some results are already visible, such as the agreements on services and investments that Brazil has signed with Chile, Colombia, and Peru. We are also working with Mexico to enlarge the scope of our free trade agreement. In fact, by 2019, most of the South American region will become a virtually free trade area as a result of the network of trade agreements signed under the ALADI, the Latin American Integration Association. Finally, not less important, Brazil has presented its bid for accession to the OECD. This process, when completed, should induce impacts at different levels for Brazil and for the global economy. All these events are likely to challenge the relative economic position of the EU in Brazil. Now, it's the moment to make decisions that will influence the infrastructure of our economic relations in the future. We have a unique opportunity to act as MERCOSUR and EU approach a crucial stage in the negotiations of the association agreement. Let me put this in context and to conclude this exposition. We are talking about one of the largest ongoing trade negotiations in the world today, with a combined GDP of approximately $19 trillion and a market of 750 million people. Among EU trade negotiations, MERCOSUR is second only to the EU-Japan trade deal, both in terms of GDP and population. But these are not the only features that make EU-MERCOSUR agreement unique. This agreement could not only grant the EU a first-mover advantage to access the goods market of MERCOSUR, but also pave the way for European companies to provide services and participate in public procurement in MERCOSUR countries. This is not a minor consideration. In Brazil alone, public procurement at the federal level is estimated to correspond to 8% of our GDP. That is 8% of $1.8 trillion. Another figure, in 2016, despite the crisis, e-commerce in Brazil increased by more than 7% to sales that reached around 12 billion euros to 48 million consumers, nearly a quarter of the Brazilian population. Furthermore, since most of the European economic operators are already present in Brazil, this trade agreement will perhaps have a more palpable effect on the small-scale economic actors. These actors will be able to access MERCOSUR market on a better competitive terms with the removal of tariffs and the establishment of mutually agreed trade rules. They, therefore, stand to gain much. This negotiation can make a lot of economic sense if both sides succeed in achieving an ambitious and balanced agreement. But it also makes sense from a strategic perspective for Brazil, MERCOSUR, and the EU. In order to achieve this, we must make progress also on the issue of agriculture. On this issue, the ball is squarely in the EU court. Its offer on beef and ethanol presented last week is out of step with the opening of the EU expects from MERCOSUR in industrial goods, IPRs, services, public procurement, and other disciplines. In a way, the agreement is an insurance policy aimed at preserving what Brazil and the EU have built together over the years. But its success depends on determination and political will on both sides of the Atlantic. The choices we make in the next few months will shape the future of our societies. We must put aside complacency and seize the opportunity to build a better future together. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Vargas. We got back to the EU-MERCOSUR agreement, which links very much with the keynote presentation we had, although a bit in controversial terms. I open the floor for all your comments on the presentations we had. There's a microphone going around. I saw this hand first, this hand, this hand. Please be concise in your questions or comments. You may make comments. You don't have to disguise comments as questions, but don't be too long.
Stasinopoulos, formally with the European Commission. I think three panel members mentioned briefly the question of China. I'd like to go back to that. There is no doubt that China and Latin America and South America and Caribbean economic relations has had a direct impact on some Latin American countries. My question is how you plan or how you calibrate for the countries, for the representatives of the panel, your policies and alignments vis-à-vis China and European Union, given that China has slightly, I would say, mildly, geopolitical objectives than the European Union. And with this context, actually, how important is for you to somehow stick strictly to the conventional economic orthodoxy of, let's say, Washington consensus? I understand, of course, within the Latin America, South America, there are different approaches. Let's say Chile and Colombia is one side, the other side is Venezuela, Brazil may be in the middle. But it's very important. I see how difficult a balancing act you have to do in aligning or calibrating your policies given our complex geopolitical environment.
Okay, thank you. We'll collect questions and then we see who from the panel will address what question.
Thank you very much. I'm Francisco Coy from the Embassy of Colombia. Thank you to the organizer for this event. Latin diplomacy in Brussels has been involved in the last few months in a regular negotiation process for the summit that has now been postponed. And we do a lot of work, a lot of hours there, but no, we usually don't have a lot of time of reflection on this. So why this event is so important. One issue that comes to my mind is regarding the trade relations. The figures are not very encouraging, but probably there's a lot of things that we need to discuss for investment and other things. But on trade itself, there is one thing that probably we need to reflect is about what you see as the probably effects of Brexit, as is going to redefine the way the European Union is going to work on trade issues. Now there is a talk that probably UK will do a push to join NAFTA. So there are, for example, Mexico is renegotiating the association agreement with the European Union, and now you have to have in mind that this issue of the UK entering in a different light on the field will probably redefine the way the relations are with the European Union. But in general, it's not only something trade or economical, but probably it's geopolitics, but something that is there. We're talking about the future, and for the European Union, when Brexit is effective, it's going to affect their future. So we'd like to have some talks on your side on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got a third question here, a comment.
Thank you. Luis Blanco, co-founder our foundation here in Brussels. I would like to come back to a point raised by Ambassador Gutierrez, which I think is very important. Of course, we see that the European Union lacks strategic view towards Latin America, because we see in all the documents, if you base your relationship on friendship and historical ties, that's not a strategic relationship. So my question is, but are we doing our part? Is Latin America making itself sexy, interesting for investors, for the EU? Because I think the past shows that, for example, Brazil in the beginning of the 2000s, when they showed that they were organizing themselves, the European Union jumped to the opportunity. Also Pacific Alliance. I remember 2013, Angela Merkel going with a big delegation to Chile, for example. If we show that we are interesting, they see the strategic value that there is. So my question is, how can we make ourselves interesting enough, not only for Germany, Spain, Portugal, or Sweden, but also to the European Union, to the Baltic countries, to Poland, those who are going to be key countries if you want to build a strategic relationship. And in this sense, just a follow-up question also to the ambassador, how do you perceive if our relationship now is conducted through EU CELAC? Do you see any possibility of us building a strategic relationship? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Guntram Wolf?
Yeah, my question is actually quite close to Louis' question, but perhaps addressing more the European panelists, so Bert and Miguel. Perhaps you can talk a bit more about, Bert, also what do you think? I mean, do we as Europeans in the current setup really consider Latin America as strategic, or do we not? I mean, what's your view of how do you assess the political assessment at this stage? Thank you.
Okay, is there one more question? So we take 2.5 more questions.
It's not a question.
Okay.
I'm Sofia Marin Bastos from the Commission, DG Connect, and I like this panel and also Mr. Ambassador's intervention. I would like to inform you that we are going to celebrate the 10th EU dialogue with Brazil on ICT cooperation this year in Brasilia. And it's not a dialogue that we will not touch upon trade issues because that's part of the MERCOSUR negotiations, but we've had the dialogue for 10 years and a lot has been done on regulatory cooperation, research. So this is a very important dialogue. This year we also had a first dialogue with Mexico, but this year my director, this afternoon, she will explain you more about what are our plans for wider EU CELAC cooperation. Thanks.
Thank you. Paola?
Thank you to the panelists. First, a comment inspired by what a member from the public from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung says. In fact, what we can observe from our small observatory of the EULAC Foundation is that there is a lot of interest and appetite exactly from what we would call the non-traditional partner of Latin America towards Latin America. Estonia celebrated for the first time this year a business forum on Latin America. In the public there is, I'm sure, a representative from Latvia, here from Riga. There are other colleagues that I haven't yet recognized, but they are here. So I think there is a window of opportunity, and I think we need to think outside the box of the traditional partner. Something that I mentioned as well, and it can be a very, and it's almost anecdotal, but the first country ratifying the Constitutive Act of the EULAC Foundation are Baltic country, Nordic country, Visegrad countries. So that's, I think it's something to bear in mind. And now I have a question. We have talked indeed of the fact that we should be more ambitious in the development of our trade and investment relation between the EU, Latin America, and the Caribbean. But I have a question on the quality of the relation. Is that not the case that for small and medium-sized enterprise of both sides, they are in the trade between the two regions more options that they might find in trade with other more distant regions? So would we not need as well a more qualitative analysis? And I think in particular so have some of the producers in Peru from the Selva that are finding outlets in the European market that they don't necessarily find in other markets. So it's not necessarily translating in big number, but it's the kind of wealth that trickle down to the community. So a question to the panel on this.
Okay, thank you. I think with that I would want to pass back to the panel to have a chance to get some, even if concise, answers, because the coffee break is coming up, but we still have got 15 minutes, I think, for a round of response. I would go in the same order of appearance we had, and everybody picks kind of the questions which were addressed to him or whatever he finds best to answer. Go ahead.
Yes, well, most of the questions were to the European panelists. Personally, I don't know what a country like Argentina or Brazil can make to be more attractive. I think procurement is actually a big attractor in our countries if we open up through these agreements. But that's something for the Europeans to think about. Regarding the Chinese, so the China question, I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but at least in the cases I know, in particular in Argentina, but also other countries where China has made investments or have a participation, I fail to see the geopolitical or the constraint there. I mean, they come and do their non-marketable trades, but I don't think in our case, for instance, there are a couple of big investments involved and there are more to come. And I don't think that constrains politics in any way. I think simply that we tend to think of China as a financier of a last resort that is typically less transparent, so that's why it's last resort. Probably we'll be resorting as we get access to international capital markets. We will be resorting less to China than more. But we have never faced a geopolitical constraint or problem there. I think they're separate issues.
Okay, thank you, Paula.
Well, very briefly about NAFTA. There was a question from our colleague from Colombia regarding NAFTA. As I said, probably no one in Mexico wanted to renegotiate. NAFTA has been a very productive agreement for the region. That's what we believe. Commerce between the three countries grew 3 times since it was signed 23 years ago. Between Mexico and the United States has grew 5 times since it was signed. Nevertheless, is an agreement that has 23 years, and that might seem not a lot of time for a person, but yes, for a trade agreement. So even if we probably never wanted to go from a comfort zone that represented NAFTA, not from the government, not from the private sector, we do see an opportunity. We do see an opportunity in this negotiation process, not just in the negotiation itself, where we can certainly improve most of its terms, but also in what has changed regarding the relationship between Mexico as a Latin American countries with the European Union, for example, where negotiation process, as our colleague from the European Commission just mentioned, has accelerated, but also through the Pacific Alliance, where we remain, as I briefly said, very optimistic. So just to finalize, we do see several opportunities in the negotiation process in itself with NAFTA, but also on what has caused with our relationship with Brazil, Argentina, Pacific Alliance, and certainly with Asia as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Gutierrez.
Well, thank you very much. Let me refer to two or three of the questions that we had. First, the how to calibrate policies towards China. I think learning from the examples, learning from the previous experiences. To put it in a word, learning from what happened in Africa. China and Africa was not, in many cases, the best example of relationship. At least in the case of my country, we try to learn from that in order to apply a policy where 3 pillars are very important to respect in terms of the investment and presence of China in Peru. The respect for the environmental rules, the respect for labor rules, and serious acceptance and compliance with the tax laws of a country. And to be very frank, even though we still have social conflicts regarding investment in general, and particularly with the Chinese, I think the relationship is working quite well. Aside that Peru has a long-standing relationship with China. 10% of our population has some blood from Chinese ancestors. We were the first country in the whole of Latin America to establish a relationship, diplomatic relations with the Qing Empire in 1874. So we have a long way with them. The different models in Latin America, you mentioned that as well. I think that should work by itself. We cannot impose a model from one side to the other. I think what should be the test, the proof of the test is the results. How the populations in each and every country realize that the model is working for them. I myself, in the case of Peru, I can claim that my country, with the open policies towards trade and in a better insertion in the world economy, we have reduced poverty from 55% to 22%. That's objective, that's numbers. So each one has to decide. Regarding the questions about the how to become more sexy to the investments from Europe, I guess the rules in most of Latin American countries are very clear. The possibility of having an improved environment also is related to keeping a good cooperation relation with Europe. And here I want to touch on another element which is important, graduation. Europe is having, to my mind, one-dimension approach towards cooperation regarding developing countries. This threshold on the GDP per capita, I think that has to be changed, and it's changing. Now the perception we realize here in Europe is changing. We have to have a more sophisticated approach in order to have better cooperation, better rules through an exchange of experiences, having a better understanding of the models, if maybe we may become more attractive to investment from Europe. And that has a close relationship with what Paula said, because small and medium enterprises should play a key role in this bi-regional relationship. But again, you cannot have efficient small and medium-sized enterprise if you don't get adequate cooperation. And in the case of Europe, that should be taken into consideration in order to see new approaches, new ways to have an efficient cooperation with the region. And in relation to CELAC as a body, I'm absolutely sure that we are going to go through the situation we are facing now. We are going to negotiate within the CELAC. We have a group which is Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, and Venezuela. We are negotiating on the date for the future summit. I'm absolutely sure that we are going to reach an agreement, and also to address the problems that we feel we have inside the group. But also we have to take into consideration that within CELAC we cannot apply the same recipes, the same approaches to each and everybody. I'm talking in economic and commercial terms. We have different models, we have to respect that models, but the European Union has to understand that within CELAC we have the Pacific Alliance, we have MERCOSUR, we have the Andean Community, we have different groups, and we have the Caribbean, which has its own, very own worries, approaches, concepts, and within the whole of CELAC, we cannot apply a single formula. There should be different formulas under a big, great umbrella of the bi-regional relationship between Europe and CELAC. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Miguel?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Very quickly on China, we have done, led by my colleague Mario Esteban, who is the lead researcher for Asia Pacific, a report on China's presence in Latin America and what it means for Spain. And basically, I mean, I think it's great work. It's very comprehensive, the report. But I mean, one of the bottom lines is Spain will not stop China to be there. So we need to adjust, and we need to take the opportunities. That's basic. But I think we now bring the debate to the European Union. As you know, there's a big debate in the European Union about how to deal with the China challenge, as we call it. And being an observer of this, I can tell you that the position has toughened a lot. I mean, you're aware of it. I mean, the position of the Europeans regarding China. If we think that we have been discussing, for example, market economy status, and a few years ago we thought it would be a disaster because the positions in Europe would be so different and we would not get to an agreement, but we got to an agreement. And now we are even debating to have some sort of screening mechanism for Chinese investments. So we have come quite a long way, and I think now, especially in Trump times and when Xi Jinping goes to the World Economic Forum and says, we are here to, the flag bearers of globalization, I think from a European perspective is, okay, then, now you're talking to the talk, but now you have to walk the walk. And I think, that pressure should be there. That China, if it wants to have open markets around the world, it needs to open up. The word is reciprocity. On Brexit, I think you can see it from two angles. One, this is bad. The UK has always been in favor of free trade, of opening markets, etc. And so therefore we are losing, a strong power that really, believes in free trade and pushes for these agreements to take place, etc. On the other hand, I have always thought that the British attitude was a bit naive in regards of how much the market can do, right? The understanding is you open up, you have more pressure. Once you have more pressure, your domestic producers, domestic actors, they get the pressure. This competition creates, so you know the whole story. And I think, maybe it's because they had their development long ago, not like a lot of our countries, that, a better understanding of, the market economy, political forces, the social forces that actually, shape an economy, that sometimes you cannot be too dogmatic and too fetishistic on what the market can do. I think perhaps if that is not there, it might be more useful. So that, I think it's ambiguous, but overall, of course, Brexit makes the European Union less liberal in that sense. On the strategic partnership, and Guntram's question and someone else, I think, I follow here a bit my colleague Carlos Malamud's view that the problem with the EU-Latin America relation is the following, is that Latin America does not know what it wants from the EU. And the EU does not really know what it wants from Latin America. This is right now, the problem. It's like, we are friends, but we don't really know why we are friends anymore. And that's problematic, at some point you need to find common interests, common hobbies, common things to do together that you can actually, get passionate about things again, But no, we are just going to the bars and drink. And we have, we enjoy, but we don't really see, the purpose of it.
We're passionate for drinking, maybe.
Yeah, maybe, that's the start. Football,
soccer.
we are passionate about football as well, I'm very pleased that Argentina made it, so, But maybe you need a bit more than that for a strategic partnership.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
but the final point, the really final point, on SMEs and all of that, I think again, I think we need to change a bit our conception of the world, our map, right? Latin America has always been on the edge of the West, right? The border of the West. You can even call it the far West. Latin America is in between the Atlantic and the Pacific. It is much more central than a lot of people, the mapping of it is problematic. So a lot of SMEs in Spain, if they would realize that now they have businesses in Latin America, they are maybe active in Latin America, they export in Latin America, etc., maybe Latin America can become a bridge for Asia. From a Spanish perspective, Asia is very far away. right? Very far away. We are really dealing with how can we penetrate more the Asian markets. And maybe Latin America, for what it was said, with the huge diaspora that you have in Latin America of a lot of Asians, etc., you have the contacts, you have to understand, you have the geographical. It's really a shame that TPP did not go forward, because that would have helped to penetrate some of those markets. So I think there, again, you know, Latin America might yield more than we think.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you, Miguel. Ambassador Vargas?
Thank you. Well, I think that from the questions and from, from the debates, I think that we put too much emphasis on the mood or the willingness of the investors. But investors are very important, undoubtedly. But decisions are not restricted to them. Actually, decisions are much more something linked to political will. And then, when we talk about political will, we have to make clear about what each other wants, one from another. I think that, at least in Brazil, but I believe in many other countries in Latin America, we all know exactly what we want. We need to eliminate our disparities, and we need to mitigate our vulnerabilities. And that's the main issue behind any agreement, any dealings with the European Union. And I think the European Union, for all these years, has had a very clear view of what Latin American market or what Latin American resources means to the development of Europe. So we have had in these last decades, if not centuries, of relationship with Europe, a very clear perception from each other for where the interests lie. The problem is how much political will do we have to look squarely on how to solve the big problems. I think that right now in the MERCOSUR EU negotiation is very clear. If you take what has been offered in terms of agriculture, it's a wide difference from what EU aims to get in terms of access to markets, in terms of services, in terms of protection of intellectual property, and so on. So I think that we need to have this very, very clearly. And in some way, the issue, perhaps the question is how much the political will trickles down to those who are operating policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me just chip in a bit on the question of the strategic partnership, and I would link it up with a China issue you raised, and the question, does Europe have a similar strategy as China with the One Belt, One Road? And I would say that it's very difficult to take China as a measuring stick. It's a very, very different entity we're talking about. In the European Union, if we speak about trade and investment, that is private business. That is by and large private business and not governments, not states, and that link is not halfway as direct as you would have in the Chinese case. So can diplomats, with all the political will, increase investment by, I don't know, 100%, 50%? No, they have to set rules, they have to think about incentives, but it's not that easy, and we should not overestimate what diplomats and agreements and cooperation frameworks can do. Having said that, we can do better than what we are doing with the MERCOSUR, and as a European citizen, I would very much hope that Europe gets not only vis-à-vis Latin America, but also for internal domestic purposes, rid of an agricultural policy which really is not fit for the 21st century, in my opinion. And I think that is a political issue as such. But by and large, a strategic partnership is something aspirational. It's not anything you can nail down in terms of percentage. If China has a higher growth rate, then that will be reflected in investment in. But what I would like to highlight is that Europe does have a specific profile which is different from the Chinese one. If we take investment, that's not that much on this mineral resources exploration, But for instance, in the manufacturing sector, it's very long-term investment in many cases, be it in Mexico, be it in Brazil, be it in other countries. And it's also including a very high degree in relative terms of skills development. We just have the CAF report on skills. You just mentioned how important education is. That is something where Europe, by and large, can be quite proud of what the investment is able to do. And even if we speak of labor, I don't think there's anything comparable to the trade union partnerships between German metallurgic unions and the Sao Paulo-based metallurgic workers in Sao Paulo. Even in that link, there are linked to the investment, also people-to-people contacts, and I think that is very specific, and there's nothing parallel in the Chinese case to that. So, having said that, don't overestimate what diplomats can do. They can do all they can do, but it's not the economic driving force in the implementation of investment. That is private business, and we have to work with them. And if they see chances, we can hope to foster these, but we cannot invent these. And perhaps a final word on the Brexit. I'm happy that you mentioned it, because I was a bit uneasy that it passed so little mentioned. Of course, that will mean that the EU loses weight. It loses a certain amount of importance. And this will be very specific, and I just want to mention it because we always have this Caribbean inside for the Anglophone Caribbean. For the Anglophone Caribbean, the EU passed mentally and in many practical ways through London, and the EU has to send a message to that part of the world also that the EU will be there even if London is no longer part of the European Union as a side effect. So, having said that, I think we have had a really very, very interesting first panel. I would thank all the panelists for their opinions and their comments and their argumentation. Also for you in the audience, we will continue with the next session, and there will be also financial flows in terms of remittances. There will be also skills issues. There will be also a lot of things we touched upon in this session, so there will be quite a continuity in that, but in between that, we all deserve, I think, a coffee break where we can continue the discussion. Thank you very much.